I saw B-17s get shot. I saw them catch on fire, turn over on their backs, maybe a wing would fall off. Looking at those airplanes going down, those B-17s spinning and going to the ground, they held together. Of course, somebody named it the Flying Fortress, and I'd agree with it. That's a good name.
On August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets led what would become one of the most controversial and devastating bombing missions in the history of warfare. Commanding and piloting the Enola Gay, Tibbets delivered and dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. Though history remembers him for this unprecedented mission, he had already proven himself an able pilot and leader over the skies of Europe, where he led the first Flying Fortress raids into heavily defended German territory. After building an impressive and decorated combat career, Tibbets would use his flying expertise to help test and perfect Boeing's B-29 Superfortress. His unique experiences did not go unnoticed, and Tibbets soon found himself teamed with the members of the Manhattan Project, devising a weapon to strike the decisive blow in World War II.
There was a man by the name of Doug Davis. He was a freelance pilot. He was a racing pilot. He was an entrepreneur. And the people that manufactured Baby Ruth, the Curtis Candy Company, came out with this new candy bar called Baby Ruth. And Doug sold them on the idea of sending him around the country where crowds would be gathered, like racetracks or fairs or something like that, and drop these candy bars out of an airplane after they'd been attached to paper parachutes. My father was, that particular time, this is best I can remember, was about 26. My father at that time was the distributor for Curtis Candies in southern Florida. And Doug's result came to my father's business. Doug looked at my father and he said, "Mr. Tibbets, I got to have somebody go fly with me to throw them out of the front seat. I'll fly the airplane and throw them out of the rear." And I said, I volunteered right quick. And my father looked at me and said, "Not you." And I said, "Well, why not?" Now, my father didn't want me to fly because he'd been scared so badly riding in an airplane in World War I. And at that same time, his partner stepped up and said, "Paul, let him go." I went with him. We took the paper-wrapped parachutes and bars out and got him into the airplane. And I looked at this airplane, gee, I never saw anything so beautiful in my life. Now, I had come to a conclusion that the airplane had to be great. Seeing them fly earlier years, as a younger kid, I was amazed that that thing up there had somebody in it. Well, when everything was ready to go and he had the thing cranked up, why, he started down, started the initial part of the takeoff, kind of bumpy. And then all of a sudden, the airplane lifted, and it was so smooth, and I was looking out, I thought, my God, we've stopped. There was nothing beside me, like a fence or a telephone post or anything to measure. Then I realized what was going on. And from that day on, I had to fly airplanes.
Can you give me some idea about what life was like in the Army Air Corps prior to the war when you started?
Well, without fear of insulting anyone, it was a real big flying club. We didn't have war in our mind. Nobody was thinking of wartime. So here you are, you got a bunch of nice airplanes that the government furnishes. You could fly them and you could go home, you could go wherever you want to go with the things in those days. They didn't have a bomber airplane. Oh, they had a B-18, and they had B-10s, but they were obsolete at the same time. And the Norden bomb sight was in existence. But it was so secret that nobody knew anything about it, and that's all I could tell you. But we learned after the war, after the war was declared, when everything opened up and it was rush, rush, rush to train people. I'll never forget the day. My organization at that time was in what they called the TAC, flying A-20 airplanes. And I was stationed at Savannah, Georgia, but we were having maneuvers because I think the people knew we were going to go to war sometime. They didn't know when. In December of '41, I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, first week. With my A-20s, I was the engineering officer. And on a Sunday, being the engineering officer, I waited on the ground until the last airplane belonging to Savannah had gotten airborne and gone back. Then I got to my airplane and started back. And I'm riding along in the bright sunshine. Those days we didn't have an autopilot. Those airplanes, you had to trim it out and fly it, but I could do that. And I didn't have to keep my feet on the rudder. I put them up on the support for the rudders. I'd ride along in this sunshine, just listening to the engines sing nice songs and looking around. And I was listening to a radio because in those days we navigated by tuning in commercial radio stations and following a needle that would take you to that station. I was listening there, the announcer came on in the middle of music or something. He said, "Please stand by, we have an important announcement to make."
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United States. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
And I shook my head. I said, "What the hell's Orson Welles up to now?" Because he was the one that used to startle the public with his radio shows. When I got back to Savannah 10 or 15 minutes later, and I landed, I knew what was going on. Pandemonium. Nobody knew what to do. We didn't have any instructions for that kind of thing. It was just by luck we had a couple of good men around Savannah that had good level heads, and they made everybody calm down. And that was it.
When I got to the 97th Bomb Group, the first time I met Paul Tibbets, I was not assigned to his plane at that time. We formed a crew and everything else. We had a fellow named Rocket as the pilot of our crew. If you remember, the first day we got out the airplane, I met Tom Furby in the nose of a B-17 of that airplane. Tom Furby and I were best friends for life until the day he died. We took all of our training in this country with Rocket as pilot. We got to England then, and Rocket was one of these guys that refused to believe that when a pub over there said we're out of beer, they were out of beer. Rocket says, "Nah, you guys have beer. Let me go back in the room there and find out what it is and everything." He made a horse's butt of himself, and so he was court-martialed. We were a crew without a pilot. Tibbets, by that time, I think he was operations officer of the group. And if he needed a crew, so we made a very nice marriage. And I always remember my wife saying to Paul, "How did you get to be flying with Dutch and Tom?" Paul, he always said, he says, "They were so screwed up, I wanted to see if anybody could straighten them out."
I had a lot of experience with the B-17, and I loved the airplane because it was tough. I didn't know anything that could hurt it. Rough landings, I had guys fly me into the runways and bounce that thing. So, okay, it was a strong airplane that built up my confidence right away. I get the first mission to go over and bomb occupied France, and that was my first time under gunfire. Luckily, the Germans really didn't quite know how to handle us because we flew at a higher altitude than the British. So all they did was they just kind of took it easy and waited. And I remember leading 3 missions before we really got it on the fourth one. But fourth one, they came in. They didn't wait. The fighters came in, the attack was heavy. I saw B-17s get shot. I saw them catch on fire, turn over on their backs, maybe a wing would fall off. Looking at those airplanes going down, those B-17s spinning and going to the ground, they held together. Of course, somebody named it the Flying Fortress, and I'd agree with it. That's a good name.
You know, there was a controversy between the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Force about whether or not we could fly the B-17s in combat. And After the first 10 missions, I was beginning to agree with the RAF, definitely, because we were losing them very, very heavily. You know, if you'd have asked me mid-1943, were we going to make it over there flying the B-17, until we got the P-51, it was in doubt.
Your safety against the Germans was based upon how close to formation you could fly with multiple numbers of airplanes, which meant 4 times that many machine guns firing at them. And on the basis of that, I had a couple of guys that in my squadron who were very good pilots, and they just automatically came in closer and closer. And a couple of times after we had done that and landed, well, the guys in the back end said, "Hey, you know, we got more dents in the fuselage." And I said, "That's good." And that's the truth of the story.
There was the mission to Enola, France. That particular mission, we were leading the mission and everything else, and we got attacked head on. And I'll point out right now, Tom Furby and I, as navigator and bombardier, never hit a damn thing. We would come back up to our ankles in gun shells and everything, and to my knowledge, we never hit anything. The safest place for a German pilot to be was up there flying against us. We had Colonel Longfellow with us on that particular mission, and this guy came through our formation and he shot hell on us. Colonel Longfellow, flying as an observer, tried to grab the controls to make matters worse. Paul knocked him out. He just gave him the elbow on the back like this and knocked him flat on his butt. Longfellow, when he came to, realized the error of his ways and apologized for doing so, but we had people shot up and everything on that flight.
I got down there because I took Eisenhower and his people to North Africa. I took them to Gibraltar, and they got waiting for the land to be declared safe to bring them into Algiers. In North Africa, the most troubling thing was Rommel. The supply line for Rommel came down through Italy, Sicily, and then they came into Bizerta, and they had a dock there for boats to come in, and that's where they were getting their supplies. Well, first thing I wanted to do was I asked the higher command, which we had, I said, let me go fly low level and go into where Rommel is getting into trouble with personal fragmentation bombs. Let me see if I can bomb it. Oh, no, that's not the business of a strategic bomber. Okay, fine. Well, I get to North Africa, and I'm down there at Bizerta all by myself. The air officer for General Mark Clark in that area. I went to him and said, look, I got 6 airplanes sitting down at the airport doing nothing. How about if I go strike some targets? And he said, jolly good thought. You go ahead and do it. I said, well, now, wait a minute. I don't have any petrol for my airplanes. I don't have any bombs to drop. They're all on British boats down at the dock in Algiers. So he called one of his men and he said, get him a lorry. That's a truck. Notify the people at the dock that he and his people are coming down. They're going to get guns. They're going to get ammunition. They're going to get bombs. They're going to get fuel.
We get out to the ships, carry our own bombs out to the airplane, load our own bombs on the airplane, go down to the ship, carry our own gasoline out there in 5-gallon cans. Have you ever refueled a B-17 out of 5-gallon cans? I have. It's not an easy thing to do.
3 days later, I went back and said, we're all ready to go. And he said, well, go ahead. I said, where do I go, Air Marshal? I don't know. He said, I want you to go and bomb the supply line for Rommel.
I went into this RAF group captain, and I said, do you have any maps? I don't have any maps of that area. How am I supposed to find my way? And he says, oh, I think we can find you a map. And he sends one of his aides out, and he comes back with a standard oil road map. That's what I used to navigate the first mission in North Africa.
I went back to my airplanes. The guys were there. We had a little huddle, and I said, now tomorrow morning we're going to take off and we're going to go. I'm going to fly low. I'm going to fly as low as I can. because I want to stay out of the radar screen if it's possible. We'll fly over the hill. I had 6 airplanes. I said, I will go right straight across the fighter field that's sitting there. You guys flying the next 3 behind me. You bomb the fighter field, and I'll get the docks. That's exactly what we did. Gosh, it was just beautiful because we were over there and almost gone before they realized that we were there. I never did understand or know what happened, but I knew it was effective. Of course, I got told that I wouldn't do that again at the same altitude because I hadn't properly used a B-17 that way.
Tibbets left our group in about the end of, sometime in January of 1943. And he went up to the 12th Air Force, Doolittle's 12th Air Force.
By that time, I was with General Doolittle in the headquarters there. He didn't have a bombardment specialist on his staff. So he took me out of the 97th after I said, General, I don't want to go to Algiers. I want to stay with my outfit. He said, I didn't ask if you wanted to go or not. You're going to go. And that ended that conversation. He called me in one day because I'd gotten my foot in hot water by telling a certain officer who was the full colonel at that time, ranked me, that he wanted to go and send the B-17s back in at low altitude like I did it. And I told him, I said, well, now you're just a little bit late by about a month or 6 weeks. I said, those Germans are prepared for that. I said, you'd lose the whole outfit if you do. And so he became angered because he's not used to anybody talking back to him. He was a man, a yes man. He wanted everybody to say yes and agree with him. But I couldn't, not with my own friends. And so he said, told him, lifted his head up and nodded to everybody around. He said, look, he said, now don't pay attention to Colonel Tibbets. He's got combat fatigue. And boy, that blew me. I put both hands down on that table and I stood up. I rightly put my nose about 18 inches from head. I said, I'll lead the group if you'll go as my co-pilot. That ended that deal. Well, anyway, Doolittle called me in his office 2 days later, and he said, you're going to go back to the United States. I said, what for? He said, well, they got an airplane back there called a B-29. I got a telephone call from Hap Arnold. He wants my most experienced bombardment officer to come back there. And he said, besides that, I got to send you back or you're going to get court-martialed, and I can't do a damn thing about it. When I got to Wichita, I found out they weren't flying them because Boeing Company had taken this position that the airplane was no good and they weren't going to make them. I understand, second-hand or third, that General Arnold told Boeing officials, you're going to build that airplane or give us back $50 million we've already advanced. They thought real quick. They said, well, we'll build the airplane, but we won't take any responsibility for it. Arnold is reported to have said, you don't have to take it. The Army Air Corps will take that responsibility. Well, okay, so I'm back there now, and a man had come in there, a one-star general, very nice man. K.B. Wolf was his name. I'm the last guy that he gives an assignment to. I don't know, there's 6 or 7 of them there. He said, I want you to go here, and somebody else go there. And I'm about the 6th or 7th in line. He looks at me, he said, what are you supposed to do? I said, General, I'm supposed to fly B-29 airplanes. He looked out the window and there were 5 YB service test models sitting out. He said, well, there's 5 airplanes out there. Go take one and fly it. Yes, sir. Nobody around there knew anything. There was no test pilot there or anything because they hadn't flown them because the test pilots had gotten killed. One of the mechanics there told me that there was a man in their organization there who had made 3 flights as an assistant flight engineer to learn the business about the engineer's panel. So I went and saw him and I said, well, can you start the engines on this airplane? He said, yes. I said, I can. I know how to do it. So I got a hold of him. We got a couple more people to act as observers in the back end, and I briefed them all. I said, we're going to get in this thing. We're going to go fly. And the co-pilot looked at me, a little bit bigger than I was, but he was a major. He said, I've never been in one of these airplanes. I said, I told General Doolittle that one time, and he told me it doesn't make any difference. He said, I'm going to get in it. You're going to get in it. We're going to fly it. Well, make a long story short, we got the thing started, and I told them what I would do is I'd taxi up and down. We had to stop every time you cranked them up and ran them for 10 minutes. You had to stop and let the engines cool. That was one of the biggest problems. And I said, when I get to the point that I've lifted it off the runway and put it back down, all I want to do is see what the ailerons do by that time. And when I did that, she just responded immediately, beautifully. There was absolutely no problem. So I shut her down, and we came to a halt at the end of the runway. Turned around, went back, got in position and cooled the engines down. Probably 30 minutes later, I said, this time let's go for keeps. And when I got on the runway, took off, and we went right on out. This engineer was a great guy. He understood what I was doing, and he had a couple of things to talk about, and he did them, and we got that thing going. Well, anyway, I sat there and flew airplanes then for quite a long time.
You went to Alamogordo, New Mexico, where you worked with Dr. Workman.
Yeah.
Who was he, and what was the purpose of that assignment?
Well, Dr. Workman was the head of the physics department at the University of New Mexico, and the Air Corps put out a request for somebody to make a bid on establishing the test between a fighter and a B-29. How could either survive against the other? And Dr. Workman was the head of that. They were having trouble down there keeping that one bird of theirs flying. It was an old model, or one of the older models, let me word it that way, and it had just been worn to a frazzle. I got in there till late afternoon, they were flying, and I saw what was going on. So then, but I had nothing for me to do until they got back with the airplane. Well, they got back with the airplane, they told me real quick that based on this performance, they had to have 2 engine changes. And so Dr. Workman was told this. Well, the next morning he was frantic. He said, here I am to the last day of testing if everything would work, and we can't do it. Now, I had gone there from Grand Island, Nebraska, and I was flying a B-29 shell. It had no turrets in it, it had nothing. It was just a flying machine, period. And I'd gone there with that, and I said, well, Dr. Workman, that airplane won't go, but I said, without cameras on my airplane, I could fly it back and forth on that track. He said, oh, great. He said, I don't care about being on the B-29, I want them on the fighters. With that, we got into the air. There was a 25-mile track, basically east and west at 25,000 feet. And I got up there with the flying machine. I went back and forth on that track, and after I'd been there about 2 hours, I'm listening to the fighters complaining, tell him to slow down, I can't catch it. Tell him to slow down, my engines are overheating. Well, I looked at my altimeter, instead of, I'd had it on autopilot, and I was watching them do fancy maneuvers out there when they come in and make an attack. And I thought to myself, what I saw at my altimeter was 31,000 feet with that thing. I said, oh, now, there is the safety factor right there. That's the best anti-aircraft device we can come up with. There's a light airplane that'll fly at that altitude. And that's what I learned from that. I had just been ordered to go to headquarters, 2nd Air Force in Colorado Springs. And the next morning I flew into Colorado Springs and went into the commanding general's office. His name was E.N.T. I gave the secretary my name. She said, oh, yes, we've been expecting you, Colonel Tibbets. The general's busy right now, but I'll notify him you're here. So she pushed the squawk box button and said, General, Colonel Tibbets is here. She said, tell him to stand by a minute. All right. I stood by, just stepped out of the way of the secretary, and about that same time, a door opens, and out comes a man, Lieutenant Colonel, wearing the insignia of the Corps of Engineers. Well, the thought went through my mind, why does a Corps of Engineer guy come out of his office? Which was none of my business, really, but I thought that's strange. And he walked right straight over to me, stuck out his hand. He said, my name's Lansdale. He said, I got some questions I want to ask you. Let's step over here to the cloakroom. And I said, fine. So we went into the cloakroom, which was removed from the immediate hearing of the secretary. First off, he said, you ever been arrested? I said, yes. What for? I said, well, my father was good to me, and I was a kid in college and whatnot. I had an automobile, had some spare money in my pocket, and I used to go take the girls. We'd go over to Miami Beach and spend the evening over there. Come back into Miami with hardly any traffic. I'd speed up down the main drags, Flagler Street, and would mainly, and I got arrested that way. He said, "Oh, I don't mean that. Anything more serious." So I knew what he was headed for. I said, "Yeah." He said, "What?" I said, "Well, one time at Surfside, which is about 16 miles north of Miami Beach at that time, there's nothing in between." I said, I was like something like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the back seat of my automobile with a young lady in a very compromising position. A flashlight comes in the window and says, "What's going on there?" And with that, of course, he knew damn well what it was. But anyway, Lansdale started laughing to beat hell. And he said, "That's all I want to know." And he said, "Let's go see General Lentz." So we walked into General Lentz's office, just knocking on the door, and walked in. And he looked at General Lentz. He said, "I'm perfectly satisfied." Well, he was head of security. He was finding out if I was going to lie to him or anything like that. And I thought, well, that's fine. But anyway, then I got briefed about what this thing was all about.
Summer 1945. The war in Europe is over. But the world is not yet at peace. In the East, Japan fights on. Her Imperial Navy is all but ruined. Her armies are destroyed or cut off on isolated islands. Her air forces are crippled by the loss of her experienced pilots. Japan's dream of empire is shattered, but her military leaders refuse to surrender. The battle for Okinawa ended in mid-June after 82 days of ferocious fighting. As Allied leaders prepared for a massive invasion of Japan's home islands, military leaders in Japan swore to fight to the very last man, woman, and child. In late July, United States President Harry Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a fateful decision, one that they hoped would end the war as soon as possible and save both the Allies and the Japanese from the bloodbath of an invasion. On 6 August 1945, the Americans unleashed a weapon the likes of which had never been seen before, the atomic bomb. 6 years and $2 billion in the making, the atomic bomb would, finally, bring an end to the Second World War. Perhaps no mission has ever changed the course of war more definitively or abruptly than the one undertaken by the 509th Special Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay. August 1945, 8:10 a.m. local time. 32,000 feet above the city of Hiroshima, Japan, a lone American B-29 bomber made its way toward a point over the city's center. Dutch Van Kirk was the navigator of that lone B-29. Today, he is the last surviving member of her 12-man crew.
To the day Paul Tibbets died, he and I would argue about whether or not I volunteered for this job. He'd say, well, when I called you, you volunteered. I'd say, yeah, when I got my damn orders, I noticed they're dated 2 days before your telephone call. So much for the volunteering part.
I was flying with the crew that, the captain in charge of that crew couldn't handle him. His name was Rocket. And nothing the matter with him, but he had two characters in his outfit he couldn't handle. One of them was Theodore Jerome, Kirk, and the other was Thomas W. Farabee. And so I said, that's the crew I want. They'll do what I want them to do. Well, it worked out that way. Of course, that's the beginning of a long relationship between the two of us. We didn't fly together too much, but we knew where each other was and all that sort of thing. When I got the bomb project, when I first started, the first two people I asked for.
On that fateful morning in Hiroshima, Japanese authorities ignored that lone bomber. It was too high for fighters or anti-aircraft fire. And besides, a single enemy bomber was not much cause for concern. At precisely 8:15 and 17 seconds, Bombardier Tom Farabee released a single 5-ton object from the aircraft's bomb bay. Freed of its heavy load, the B-29 surged upward. Sergeant Wyatt Dusenberry, the flight engineer, pushed the throttles forward, and the pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, banked the aircraft left into a gut-wrenching turn that would take it far away from the target as quickly as possible. It was an evasive maneuver the crew had practiced many times. The object fell for 43 seconds through the clear air toward its aiming point, the T-shaped Aoi bridge. At 1,890 feet above the waking city of Hiroshima, the object, known to its builders as the Little Boy, erupted in an unimaginable burst of heat and light, a single weapon with the power of 13 to 18,000 tons of high-explosive TNT. In an instant, its 1,200-foot fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Near ground zero, sand melted into glass, and every living thing was vaporized or turned instantly to carbon. A full mile from the center of the blast, the shockwave turned buildings into shrapnel. In the cockpit of the Enola Gay, 9 miles from the blast, it was as if 1,000 flashbulbs had popped off all at once. In the tail, Gunner Bob Karen winced in pain and tore off the special goggles issued to the crew. Even through the polarized welding glass lenses, he feared he had been struck blind by what he later described as the fire of 1,000 suns. Of all the Enola Gay's crew, Karen had the best view of the blast. To the rest of the crew, he described a roiling, fiery mushroom-shaped cloud that boiled up 30, 40, 50,000 feet. A moment later, the first shockwave from the blast hit the airplane, shaking the huge bomber like a leaf in a gale. The aircraft was shaken a second time as the shockwave rebounded off the earth below, but the Enola Gay held together. Deke Parsons, the Enola Gay's weaponeer and bomb commander, sent a coded message to Tinian. The mission was a success. Below, the city had vanished beneath a boiling pall of dirty brown smoke. Flames were erupting everywhere. Karen likened it to bubbling molasses or the fires of hell. Colonel Tibbets turned the plane broadside to the blast to give the crew a better view. While Karen wrestled with a bulky K-20 camera, the rest of the 12-man crew was mostly silent.
The first thing we saw was a mushroom-shaped cloud, so-called mushroom-shaped cloud. All different colors within the base of that cloud. And on top of it was a mushroom you could see. It was up well above our altitude already, I'd guess, 40,000 going higher. And then as we turned on around and everything, we could see the city of Hiroshima, and we could make absolutely no visual observation because the entire city was covered with thick black smoke and everything. You want the description of it? I say it looked like a pot of boiling oil down there.
As Tibbets turned the Enola Gay toward Tinian and home, many of the men on board shared a single thought. This could be the end of the war. As they headed back to their base at Tinian, 6 hours away in the Marianas Islands, the men aboard the Enola Gay were awestruck by what they had seen. They struggled to find the words to describe it. From the tail, Karen could see the mushroom cloud for more than an hour. Finally, 400 miles from Hiroshima, he reported to the rest of the crew that the cloud was no longer visible. As the plane flew southward across the featureless Pacific Ocean, conversation dwindled among the crew as the excitement of the mission wore off.
We were all so damn tired of coming back. It didn't make any difference what mood we were in, for crying out loud.
From Tinian, Captain Parsons' radio message was forwarded to the Pentagon. President Harry Truman was aboard the USS Augusta, returning from a meeting with Britain's Winston Churchill and Russia's Joseph Stalin. During lunch with a group of enlisted men, Truman was handed a copy of the message from Tinian. "This," he exclaimed, "is the greatest thing in history."
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
Aboard the Enola Gay, the crew talked of the end of the war. Some speculated that it might be all over by the time they landed at Tinian. How could the Japanese fight on?
Everybody said they can not possibly stand up to force like this. In fact, Dick Nelson made it much simpler. He said, "This war is over."
The atomic bomb was an entirely new weapon, more complex, more sophisticated, and more deadly than any weapon system that had come before it. The airplane that delivered the atomic bomb was equally innovative, a technological marvel. At the time, it was the largest and most sophisticated aircraft ever flown. With its large bomb load and very long range, the B-29 was designed and built for just one purpose: to strike at the very heart of Imperial Japan. In 1939, with the threat of war gathering in Europe, the Army Air Corps requested design proposals for a very long-range super bomber.
Things looked so bad in Europe that it would look like Great Britain would be defeated and occupied by the Nazis, and the United States would have to bomb Europe from the United States. And so there came into being the idea of the intercontinental bomber. Now, it was ultimately realized in the B-36, but it set everybody's minds thinking.
Boeing Aircraft Company had a set of brilliant engineers.
They had done a whole series of design studies that led ultimately to the B-29. They incorporated in it so many things that would otherwise be regarded as too risky to involve into a single design to get the performance that they thought they would need. They incorporated pressurization in a bomber. They incorporated new engines, new propellers, new fire control systems, new metallurgy, new types of aluminum in it. Everything was pushed to an extreme. When it came into being, it had a very checkered career. There were constant problems with engine fires and so on. And yet, without a doubt, it was the most advanced bomber of the war. So it was the supreme bomber of World War II.
Boeing's B-17 bomber could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and had a maximum range of 2,000 miles at a top speed below 300 miles per hour. For its new super bomber, the Army Air Corps specified a bomb load of 20,000 pounds, a top speed of 400 miles per hour, and a range of over 5,000 miles. The B-29 would be the largest and most complex aircraft of the Second World War. It would extend the range of strategic bombing over distances never before seen in combat. With its pressurized compartments, automated gun controls, huge engines, and immense size and range, B-29 was, in its day, one of the most complicated pieces of movable machinery ever manufactured. And it was designed, built, tested, refined, and ready for combat in just 4 years. Building the B-29 was not a simple task. Thousands of subcontractors fed parts to the 5 main assembly plants, 2 in Washington State and 1 each in Georgia, Kansas, and Nebraska. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941 and brought the United States fully into World War II, the ex-B-29 prototypes were not yet completed. But the Army was already impressed with the design. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the B-29 went into full production with an order for 500 aircraft. The prototypes had not yet been flown. In the first months of the war, it was clear to American military planners that no other bomber had the necessary range to strike decisively at the heart of Japan, and the Army pressured Boeing to complete the B-29s in record time. But the Air Corps requirements for the B-29 were challenging. Its design was highly advanced, and the aircraft was plagued with problems. Throughout the B-29's development, and for much of its service life, the most common source of problems was the engines. The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclo was one of the most powerful radial engines ever built. With its 18 air-cooled turbocharged cylinders in 2 rows, this mammoth produced up to 3,700 horsepower. But it had problems. The rear cylinders tended to overheat and cause engine fires. The crankcase was made of high magnesium alloy. It burned so intensely that it could burn through the main wing spar in seconds, with predictable and catastrophic results. Once it was airborne, the B-29 could fly on just 2 of its 4 engines, but the failure of a single engine during takeoff could be disastrous, with a full combat load of bombs and fuel. Other problems included uneven distribution of the air-fuel mixture to the cylinders and the engine's tendency to eat its own valves. During World War II, nearly all B-29s operated in the tropics, where high temperatures on the runway increased the risk of engine fires and reduced aircraft performance. Engineers at Boeing and Curtiss-Wright tried many fixes, but the B-29's engine problems continued until the introduction of the 28-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R-4360, which came too late for World War II. During the war, mechanics in the field scrambled to keep up with the fixes ordered by the engineers, including replacing the 5 top cylinders on each engine every 25 hours of engine time and replacing each entire engine every 75 hours. It was hardly standard practice to put an airplane into production before its prototype had been built and flown. Through 1942 and 43, as bugs in the design were discovered and fixed, many changes were applied on the production line. The B-29 is just one example of progress being accelerated by the demands of war. By the end of 1943, production was in full swing, but there were so many changes that the B-29s coming off the production line were flown straight to modification depots for extensive refits. Bad weather and other delays meant that in early 1944, Boeing had built nearly 100 B-29s, but fewer than 15 were airworthy. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Air Corps, stepped in to tighten the screws, and by mid-April, 150 B-29s were ready for deployment.
At B-17, you always put your oxygen mask on. When you wore your oxygen mask continuously, if you moved around, you had to take a portable bottle with you, and it was cold, it was uncomfortable, it was noisy. I could give you a lot of things wrong with it.
Power settings had to be calculated precisely and frequently for best performance. Getting the right takeoff and landing speeds was especially critical, based on weight, air temperature, and field elevation. But all the extra charts and arithmetic paid off in more speed and longer range. The most revolutionary feature of the B-29 was its Central Fire Control System, or CFCS. Each of the 4 gun turrets mounted 2 50-caliber machine guns. Each turret could be controlled by any one of 4 analog computers, 1 in the nose and 3 in the pressurized waist compartment. The 5th gunner, in the tail, could control his own pair of 50-caliber machine guns or the guns in the rear ventral turret. The crewman in the rear dorsal turret was the central fire control gunner, who assigned the turrets to each of the other gunners. The computer-controlled gun sight for each turret compensated for the B-29's speed, the target's speed and angle, temperature, humidity, and gravity. The analog gun sight computer was highly advanced for its time and gave B-29 gunners an effective kill range of 1,000 yards, twice the range of a manually aimed gun turret. Paul Warfield Tibbets, Jr., the man who would later become a U.S. Air Force and aviation icon as the commander of the first ever atomic bomb mission, was born in Quincy, Illinois on 23 February 1915. The family moved to Iowa in 1918, where Tibbets' father worked in his family's grocery business. When young Paul was 9, his father moved the family to Miami, Florida, and, with a partner, started a successful wholesale candy company. In the summer of 1927, Doug Davis, a barnstorming pilot, was under contract with the Curtis Candy Company to fly over county fairs, horse races, and other public events and drop its new Baby Ruth candy bars from his airplane. In Miami, Davis came to see the elder Tibbets, who was the distributor for Curtis Candies. Young Paul sat in on the meeting and was enthralled by the dashing pilot. Davis needed someone to ride along in his airplane and drop the candy. Young Paul volunteered. Reluctant at first, his father agreed.
He looked at my father and said, "Mr. Tibbets, I have to have somebody fly with me in the front seat and throw these bars out. While I fly from the back seat, I'll throw them out there." And of course, I held my hand up right away. My father looked at me and he said, "No, not you." And my dad's business partner said, "Paul, let him go, for God's sake, let him go." And Doug Davis spoke up at the time. He said, "Mr. Tibbets," he said, "I'm married. I got a lovely wife and 2 lovely girls, daughters." And he said, "I'm going out there fly this airplane just like it should be flown. I'm not going to hurt myself, and I'm sure not going to hurt him." And my father relented and said, "Okay." And that was gave me my first ride, throwing candy bars out over Hialeah racetrack. Well, I'm fascinated by that machine. I'm telling you, it's nothing like it.
As they flew over the local racetrack just after the second race, Paul threw out handfuls of the sweets. The Baby Ruths landed on target, and as the crowd scrambled for the goodies, Davis made 2 more bomb runs over the track before heading downtown to the beach. They flew similar missions every day for a week before Davis moved on to another city. He later joined Eastern Airlines and became its most famous pilot, helping to pioneer air travel in the U.S. Young Paul Tibbets never forgot the excitement of those flights over Miami. In 1928, as young Tibbets prepared for 8th grade, his father sent him to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, where he would spend the next 5 school years. At first, Tibbets rankled at the discipline of the academy, but eventually he chose to make the best of it. He became a good student and an average athlete. He had a few run-ins with the cadet commander over various infractions, but the fairness with which he was disciplined made a lasting impression, and it would influence his own style as a commander in World War II. In later life, he described his 5 years at the academy as distasteful, but he also believed that they were useful in preparing him for the challenges he would face as an adult. The summer before he started college, Tibbets hung around Miami's Opa-locka Airport, fueling planes and doing chores to earn money for flying lessons. He soloed that summer in a Taylor Cub after 6 hours of dual instruction. After 5 years of military school, Tibbets had trouble adjusting to the freewheeling college life, and he nearly flunked out of the University of Florida. As a pre-med student at the University of Cincinnati, he helped out in a local clinic and spent his free time flying for the fun of it. Tibbets found himself less and less enthusiastic about his chosen career in medicine and more excited about aviation. As Tibbets pondered his future in late 1936, Douglas Aircraft Company introduced the DC-3 airliner. Suddenly, commercial air travel went from daring to safe and reliable, and Tibbets found his calling. Lacking the funds for a commercial pilot's license, he applied to be a cadet in the Army Air Corps and was inducted in February 1937.
I said, Dad, I'm going to be leaving school. He tried to look at me, leaving school, what for? Well, I'm going down to San Antonio and become a flying cadet and learn to fly airplanes in the Army Air Corps. He said, well, you're over 21, I guess that's all right. But he said, I want to remind you of something. He said, going back for a long time, I've supported you pretty well. I bought your clothes and did everything for you, put shoes on your feet and all that. But he said, now that's finished. You're on your own.
The Army, he reasoned, would teach him to fly and launch him on a career as an airline pilot. It never occurred to him that he might fly in combat. At Randolph Field in Texas, he was determined not to wash out. His 5 years at Alton had taught him all about military discipline and spit and polish. If following the rules was the key to success, he would follow them to the letter, avoiding every temptation to slack off or show off. Tibbets finished basic training at the head of his class and received the Army Air Wings in February 1938. As a top graduate, he was given his choice of assignment: pursuit, as fighters were called then, or observation. There were no bomber pilots in the Air Corps in those days. On the advice of one of the tactical officers at Randolph, he chose observation. That would open the door to solo missions and multi-engine training. During advanced training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Tibbets met a pretty department store clerk named Lucy Wingate. They were married in June 1938. After completing his advanced multi-engine training, Tibbets stayed at Fort Benning, flying the Martin B-10 bomber, mostly towing gunnery targets. In early 1940, the Air Corps' 3rd Attack Group received the new Douglas A-20 Havoc. To fly the high-performance attack bomber, the Army searched for pilots with 1,000 hours or more of multi-engine time. Tibbets' name was on that list. He was transferred to the group's base at Hunter Field near Savannah and assigned as engineering officer for the 90th Attack Squadron. In 1940, the focus was on Europe, not Japan and the Pacific. In occupied Europe, the Germans were building flak towers up to 100 feet high and mounting anti-aircraft guns on top of them. Pilots in the 3rd Attack Group learned to fly their A-20 Havocs at high speed in tight formations, at 100 feet or less above the ground. That would allow them to fly below the German flak towers, hugging terrain to avoid enemy gunners and plane spotters. Tibbets enjoyed the challenge. It required steady nerves and precise flying skills. By 1941, it was becoming clear to many Americans that the war was coming. The U.S. was organizing its civil defense system for warning of air attacks. Tibbets' 90th Squadron was charged with putting the new system to the test. Their simulated low-level attacks on cities like Boston and New York showed that the system was woefully inadequate. Theoretically, Tibbets later wrote, he and his squadron destroyed most of the East Coast. Attacking coastal cities, roaring in on the wave tops in tight formation at 200 miles per hour, the A-20s would sometimes nudge each other, a wingtip denting a fuselage or propeller nibbling at an elevator. But there were no serious accidents, and the pilots of the 90th Squadron became experts at low-level tactics. Tibbets was on a return flight to the squadron's base at Savannah when he heard the news that the Japanese had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Tibbets was selected for training in the new B-17 bomber, and the B-17s were slow in coming. He was temporarily assigned to form an anti-submarine patrol unit flying Douglas B-18 bombers. As American war production geared up, the big flying fortresses began to arrive, along with the crews that would fly them. The B-17 was the largest land plane of its day, and some people thought it was too big and too complex for regular Army Air Corps crews to handle. Tibbets was given command of the 40th Squadron of the 97th Heavy Bomb Group at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida. It was his task to prepare his green B-17 air crews for combat. It was an exhausting job. Tibbets sometimes flew 18 hours a day checking out the new pilots. There was little time and few resources to turn the raw airmen into effective combat crews.
Now, the training was nothing. You just flew the airplane around. You'd take barrels out in the Gulf of Mexico and drop them into water, and they'd go fly around and shoot at them. That was our training. We had no gunnery training or anything. Most of the time we didn't have ammunition to train. When we got to England, we were the blind leading the blind. Believe me, we were.
Too soon, Tibbets' squadron was ordered to the West Coast, bound for the Pacific.
We got orders to go to Fresno, California. Now, the group commander was not with me, but he got on the telephone. He called me. He said, "Paul, you're going to get orders to go to Fresno, California. I am in Pennsylvania here at Olmsted with the other two squadrons," which I knew. He said, "I will get the message. I will send one message to you about where to go, and I will join you later." I got my message. We got in the airplanes, and we started for Fresno, California.
During their few weeks in Fresno, California, Tibbets drilled his men constantly in formation flying, navigation, and other critical skills. But when their orders came, the 97th Bomb Group was sent back across the country to Bangor, Maine. In early June, they were finally ordered to England. On 17 August 1942, Tibbets led 18 B-17s on the first daylight raid by American bombers on German-occupied Europe. Their target was the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. Prior to that raid, British and American bombers had been striking German-occupied targets only at night. The Germans at Rouen were not expecting a daylight raid. Tibbets and his bombers caught them by surprise that day. About half the squadron's bombs hit their targets at Rouen. Their accuracy was less than was hoped for, but it was still much better than nighttime raids were achieving. 2 of Tibbets' bombers were damaged by flak. Their Spitfire escorts drove off 3 German fighters. All the bombers returned safely to England. The only injuries were caused by a pigeon that smashed through the nose of one plane, pelting the bombardier and navigator with shards of plexiglass. In October, Tibbets led B-17s and B-24s to Lille, France. It was the first time more than 100 bombers were joined in a single raid. Dutch Van Kirk would become Tibbets' navigator, entered the Army Air Corps cadet program in October 1941, and earned his navigator's wings 6 months later at Kelly Field in Texas.
After about a week there, maybe 2 weeks, they called out a bunch of names of about 30 people, and they got us together and they said, "You people are going through here in half the normal time." Well, they forgot been doubled up on the calisthenics as well as the classes and everything else. They could almost kill us, for heaven's sakes. So we finally convinced them they only needed the regular calisthenics, but we went through in double time, and we almost all went to the 97th Bomb Group over there. My first combat mission, we didn't get any enemy action. So I come back and I thought, oh, this is a snap, no touching to it. And I think it was maybe the third or fourth mission that I changed my mind. I've been looking out the window on my on the right-hand side. We had two guns up there, one out the right, one out the left, and a 30 caliber out the nose. And we never hit a damn thing, but that's okay. I was looking out the window on the right-hand side. I turned around and looked back a little bit, look out the window on the left-hand side. By the time I turned around and looked back out the window on the right-hand side, there were 4 bullet holes where my head had been. And I decided, they're shooting at me. I earned my money today. So from that on, we knew we were in a war.
That October, Tibbets, now a lieutenant colonel, was given the job of flying General Mark Clark from England to Algeria to meet with French commanders prior to Operation Torch, the American invasion of North Africa. Tibbets stayed in North Africa flying bombing missions when it moved to Algiers. In January of 1943, he became Chief of Bomber Operations for General Jimmy Doolittle, who commanded the 12th Air Force in Africa. Less than a month later, General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, asked Doolittle to send back to the States his best field grade officer with the most experience in B-17s. The Air Forces had a problem, and Paul Tibbets was just the man to fix it. Arriving in Washington in late February 1943, Tibbets learned that the Army Air Force's newest bomber, the B-29, was in serious trouble. The aircraft was plagued with problems, mostly related to the newly developed Wright R-3350 engines. In July, Tibbets was sent to New Mexico to test the B-29 bomber's combat characteristics, with P-47 fighters making simulated attacks. The big bomber was hard to control in the thin air at high altitudes. It would be impossible to fly in tight combat box formations. Tibbets began to doubt the airplane's ability to survive in combat. On a day when his regular test plane was out of service, he borrowed a stripped-down B-29. Without its 7,000 pounds of guns and ammunition, the plane flew higher and faster and was much easier to control. Above 30,000 feet, the lightened B-29 could turn tighter than a P-47 and could outrun the fighters. It was an important lesson that he would later put to good use. In September 1944, Tibbets was called to Colorado Springs to organize and train a bomber group for a super-secret mission, one that might end the war. The Manhattan Project, America's program to develop an atomic bomb, was far enough along that figuring out how to deliver the weapon and training the crews to do it had become an urgent concern. The Army Air Force did not want a suicide mission. Tibbets' job was to figure out how to deliver the bomb safely and to assemble a bomb group specially trained to drop the weapon. He was to prepare 2 special bomber squadrons, one for Japan and one for Germany. Tibbets would get whatever men and resources he needed. If anyone refused, the code word "silver plate" would breach all barriers. As his base, Tibbets chose Wendover Field in Utah. The facilities were adequate and very isolated. USO comedian Bob Hope called it Leftover Field. The men called it the end of nowhere. As the core of his 509th Composite Group, Tibbets chose the 393rd Bomber Squadron, a combat-ready B-29 unit. And he began bringing in the best crewmen from his B-17 days. Bombardier Tom Farabee, navigator Dutch Van Kirk, flight engineer Wyatt Dusenberry, and tail gunner Bob Karen. These men formed Tibbets' own B-29 crew and helped to train the other crews.
It really came home to me when you saw, when they were describing what you were going to do, that you were going to do something that would destroy an entire city. It could be you're going to shorten the war or end the war. And you saw a bunch of guys running around who you knew were nuclear physicists. How many people in the organization knew enough about atomic energy at that time to guess that we were working on an atomic bomb is beyond me.
Security was extremely tight. Only Tibbets knew the unit's true purpose, and the men were cautioned, don't talk to anyone, and don't even be curious.
You didn't talk about it, because if you did, you would get sent up to the illusions. There's no place like that.
How does one drop an atomic bomb and get away safely?
The scientists came to us and right at the beginning, and one of them said, "We think you will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes." I can remember looking at the guy and saying, "What the hell do you mean you think?" We could be wrong. Some guys are saying it could be 50 miles away. Some people are saying you can't get far enough away.
The bomb would be released from 6 miles high. A steep turn of 155 degrees and a shallow dive for speed would put the plane about 9 miles away from the explosion.
Immediately we decided we wanted to use stripped-down B-29s. These were B-29s that had all the turrets taken out, all the guns taken out except the tail guns, as much of the weight as we could get out of that B-29, take it out and get rid of it, so it could get up higher and go faster. We could not have done this mission in a regular B-29.
With stripped-down B-29s, the crews dropped dummy bombs and practiced navigation and the evasion maneuver that Tibbets had worked out. Germany surrendered on 8 May 1945. The 509th Composite Group now had only one target: Japan. They were ready, but at Los Alamos, the scientists argued about the odds. A 1 in 10,000 chance that the bomb's trigger would fail. They wanted 1 in a million. Tibbets said he would take 10,000 to 1 any day, and he gave the order to move the bombers to Tinian, 1,500 miles from Japan. The pieces were in place for a mission that might end the war.
Most people have no concept of why we dropped the bombs at the time we did. They just assume that we dropped the bombs in order to cause those large casualties. They do not take time to read it and understand it. And no matter what you tell them, I don't think most people will never understand it. You go to high schools today, and the high schools today don't understand anything about World War II. I think I did describe how I was introduced at one's high school as a veteran of World War XI.
He was supposed to be a doctor, but fell in love with flight as a young boy and never gave up his dream of flying. He proved himself in the war over Europe and demonstrated in a series of bold missions that he could not only fly, but lead. He played an instrumental role in the development and deployment of the B-29 Flying Fortress, and every pilot who flew that plane flew it the way he taught them. And when the Manhattan Project bore its terrible fruit, the job of ending World War II fell to him. He planned the mission, set up the training and logistics to support it, and when the president gave the order, he flew the plane that ushered in the atomic age.
To think of Paul Tibbets as just the commander of the aircraft that dropped the first atomic weapon is to do the man a little bit of a disservice. It was truly a defining moment in the world history. But Tibbets himself had been an outstanding pilot.
He is General Paul Tibbets. Paul Tibbets was born in Quincy, Illinois, on February 23, 1915. His father, a strict disciplinarian, served in World War I and never recovered from the death and destruction he witnessed there. After the war, he moved his family to Florida and got a job as far away from the military as he could, selling candy for the Curtis Candy Company.
When we got old enough to know what I was talking about, why, my father told me I was going to become a doctor. Having learned earlier not to disagree with him, and openly, I believed him. I believed him until I got my first airplane ride at the age of about 12.
Tibbets' first flight was over the Hialeah racetrack in Miami. He flew in a biplane and helped the pilot throw candy bars down on the crowd as promotion. His father, down on the ground, disapproved of his son's obvious love of flight.
I knew that I was going to have to be a pilot. I didn't tell my dad, because I didn't have nerve enough at age 12 to say anything.
Tibbets' family sent him to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, where he played football with future fighter ace Butch O'Hare. Tibbets went on to the University of Florida. Florida lacked a medical school at the time, so Tibbets transferred to the University of Cincinnati. During the summers back in Florida, he snuck off to sunny South Airfield for flying lessons. Without telling his parents, he enlisted in the Army and drove from Cincinnati to Wright Field in Dayton for a flight physical. A few weeks later, he was sworn in as a flight cadet and ordered to San Antonio for training. He took a train to Florida, dreading the conversation with his father.
Finally, I got my nerve right up to peak, and I looked at him. I said, I want to tell you, I'm leaving college. I'm going to go down to flying school at San Antonio, Texas, learn to be a pilot in the Army Air Corps. He looked at me, he said, you know, I've been supporting you ever since you've been little, and I've been sending you through school. But since you're leaving school, you're on your own from here on. And go kill yourself. I don't give a damn.
Tibbets' mother was more understanding and encouraged him to follow his dream. But Tibbets' relationship with his father was changed forever. And as he reported to San Antonio, he felt as if one life had ended and a new life was beginning. Tibbets earned his wings in 1938. Clearly the outstanding pilot in his class, he surprised everyone by choosing multi-engine aircraft instead of fighters. He believed he would have more independence flying reconnaissance, and spent the next 2 years logging hundreds of hours in ungainly observation craft. In 1941, he became Group Engineering Officer of the 3rd Attack Group. He trained in the A-20, the Army Air Force's new low-level attack bomber. Reassigned in early December to fly B-18s on anti-submarine patrol, Tibbets was on his way to his new base when he heard of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The entry of the United States into the war, of course, changed everything. The Army Air Force changed Tibbets' assignment to B-17s. The training pace was frantic as Tibbets and the other flyers struggled to learn the almost entirely new art of strategic bombing. For 6 months, they flew hour after hour to targets hundreds of miles away, practicing for the battles to come. After 6 months of dry runs and pretend bombing, with the United States newly at war and completely unprepared for what would follow, Tibbets and the 97th Bomb Group got their overseas orders. In the summer of '42, Tibbets took off from Bangor, Maine, to fly the Great Circle route to England. There he knew the war awaited him. When Captain Paul Tibbets arrived in Europe, England seethed with war. The Battle of Britain had been fought and won. The RAF controlled the skies over England, and the threat of a German invasion no longer loomed large. Still, the survival of Great Britain remained in enough doubt that the English exported most of their scientific research to the safer shores of North America. Among those who left were scientists working on advanced radar, and a small group of German expatriates who were gradually unraveling the secrets of the atom. Thousands of Americans flooded the countryside, taking up residence in hastily constructed air bases at the ends of mud roads. The skies were filled with bombers and fighters, an air force unlike any ever assembled, with a single mission: hit Germany, and hit it hard. Though just one of hundreds of young captains, Tibbets stood out. He and his crew seemed more ready for war than the other crews. And for that reason, the Army Air Force chose him to lead the first American daylight attack against German-occupied Europe. While nominally under the command of General Ira Eaker, Tibbets handled the operational details and execution. On August 17, 1942, 18 B-17s took off from England to bomb a train yard near the French city of Rouen. The mission went off without a hitch, and all 18 planes returned home safely. In late 1942, the European Command tapped Tibbets to fly General Mark Clark on a secret mission from England to Gibraltar. Clark was laying the groundwork for Operation Torch, the American invasion of North Africa. Clark's mission was to meet with Admiral Darlan, the commander of the French colony of Algeria, to find out if the French Navy in Algiers would resist the American invasion. Tibbets flew Clark around occupied Europe, staying low over the Atlantic Ocean the whole time. Clark's negotiations with Darlan went well, and the French admiral agreed not to resist the American invasion. Clark returned, and with a glowing report, not only about Darlan, but also about the young pilot who had executed the dangerous flight with so little apparent trouble. So it was no surprise when a few weeks later, Tibbets got the job of flying Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and his entourage to Gibraltar to observe the actual invasion.
We're standing there waiting, and it's almost midnight at night because the weatherman from the base had come in. Each time weather was still, marginal for takeoff even. They just said it was dangerous. Last time, we're standing under the airplane, and he comes up, and he looks at General Eisenhower, and he says, "General, I cannot promise you any better weather than this for the next 4 days." He said, "It's terrible, but that's my forecast. We'll have the same thing for 4 days." And Eisenhower looked at Jimmy Doolittle, and he said, "Jimmy, what should we do?" Doolittle looked right back at him and said, "Don't ask me, General. Paul's flying the airplane. He's the man." And with that, I was looking at General Eisenhower. I said, "General Eisenhower, I realize the importance of you and your staff and the people. But if I'd been here alone, I'd have been gone by this time. I wouldn't have been waiting all this time. I'd been gone." And he said, "Let's go. I got a war waiting on me."
Tibbets took off in a pea soup fog. Eisenhower sat on a board propped between seats in the cockpit. Once again, Tibbets flew low to stay out of sight of patrolling German fighters. He covered more than 1,000 miles, only a few feet above the tops of the waves. He got Eisenhower to Gibraltar just as the invasion started, only a few minutes after the first paratroops landed. The ground crew was amazed. Tibbets' plane was encrusted with salt from flying so low over the ocean. Eisenhower told his staff that Captain Tibbets was the best pilot he'd ever flown with.
I had stayed pretty close to the Whitecaps in that. I always talked about that. And Eisenhower later complimented me and, so that sort of thing about what a nice ride he had. And I didn't know until just a year ago, Eisenhower held a private pilot's license. He had earned it as a first lieutenant in the Philippines.
Doolittle apparently agreed with Eisenhower. After letting the captain fly a few more combat missions over North Africa, the general had him transferred to the 12th Air Force, which was trying to adapt to the B-26 Marauder. The Marauder was a nasty airplane, finicky in flight and difficult to control. Tibbets, however, quickly mastered the plane and seemed adept at helping those around him master the aircraft as well. Halfway around the world in Wichita, Kansas, Boeing was fighting to tame the Air Corps' newest bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. A huge plane capable of carrying a massive bomb load, the B-29 was a strategic planner's dream that had turned into a pilot's nightmare. Since rolling off the assembly line, the B-29 had killed the only crew that knew how to fly it. The Army Air Force needed a pilot who could come in, get a handle on the plane, and in effect save what was at that time the most expensive weapon system in history. In July 1943, Tibbets reported to Boeing in Wichita. A line of B-29 sat parked on a taxiway. They were huge, technologically advanced, and, without crews to fly them, absolutely useless. Tibbets looked around, shook a few hands, and asked an engineer if he knew how to start the plane's engines. When the engineer said he could, Tibbets grabbed a pilot who was walking by and told him they were going flying.
He said, I've never been in one. I don't know how to fly it. I said, don't make a difference. I haven't been in one either, but we're going to fly this airplane. And with that, now, not trying to be funny, but I knew damn well if it flew like an airplane, I could fly it.
Tibbets and his stunned co-pilot taxied back and forth on the runway, getting a feel for the plane. Tibbets tested the brakes and the ailerons, stopping now and then to cool the engines, which were designed for the cold temperatures at high altitude. And then, with a small crowd looking on and wondering if he had lost his mind, he took off. Over the next few days, he and his improvised crew logged 10 hours in the unflyable bomber.
I did do the Phase 5 flight test for the factory and the government because there was nobody to fly that airplane in thunderstorms and things like that, but they wanted to measure stresses and strains, and I got to like the airplane, and I was really happy with it.
After mastering the aircraft and documenting its flight characteristics, Tibbets set up the school that trained every B-29 pilot who fought in the war. It was at that school that Tibbets was first approached about the mission that would etch his name forever in the history books. Walking into the ready room after flying a training mission, a mysterious captain approached him and started asking questions. Tibbets apparently gave the right answers, because after a few minutes, the captain introduced Tibbets to a second, older man.
Young man. And he said, I want to tell you about the Manhattan Project. So he gave me an outline about split. First off, he said, do you know anything about atoms? And I said, no.
The massive research effort to design an atom bomb had been going on for years. It was called the Manhattan Project, a code name designed to mislead those who stumbled across its paper trail into thinking it had something to do with sewers in New York City. In fact, it was the most monumental engineering project in history, a crash program to turn the most esoteric area of theoretical science into a working weapon.
They knew that it would do something. They knew, well, yes, it'll drop 100,000 tons of TNT, but what's 100,000 tons of TNT? Or how much, no one knew. No one ever seen that much in one place at one time.
The program was, by almost any measure, an amazing success. And as the first test of a nuclear bomb approached, the last piece of the puzzle became not scientific or technical, but logistical. How to deliver the bomb to the target. Doing that was not going to be easy. There were two designs for an atom bomb, and both were too big to fit in the bomb bays of even a B-29. The explosion itself would be so large that it might incinerate the crew that delivered the weapon. So a new type of mission would have to be designed. All of this would require the assembly and training of a logistics train stretching from the United States to the target. Hundreds of crewmen, mechanics, and other support personnel working in secretive isolation.
I was confident enough. I knew I could do it. I mean, at that time, I had so much confidence that you can't imagine. I'd been successful in everything I'd undertaken. And to put an airplane together to carry a bomb, to get the people to fly them, maintain them, and all that sort of thing, I had no problem with them.
Tibbets' reputation was not only that he was extremely competent, yes, but he was also a wonderful pilot, and he was also a leader of men. He had demonstrated that time and time again, and he had also demonstrated his abilities firsthand to major figures in the United States Army. So they knew who this man was.
It's difficult to imagine a person who would have been better qualified. Or have done it better.
The Army could do little to help Tibbets do his job because no one had ever done what he was charged with doing. He was given a vote of confidence that included a caveat. Do it right, you're a hero. Do it wrong, you may go to jail. Armed only with his own knowledge and a code word, silver plate, that would get him whatever he wanted without question, Tibbets went to work setting up what became the 509th Composite Group.
And General Ed had told me when I left his office, he said, you You go by a window over Utah and take a look at it. If you like that place, you can have it. He said, if you don't like that, go to South, forgotten where field is, South Dakota. And then he gave me one in Kansas. He said, if you like them, you can have them. If you don't like them, we'll hunt for one you will like.
Tibbets liked Wendover just fine. Located on the Utah-Nevada border, it was only a few hours from the Los Alamos nuclear test site, so Tibbets' crew could support the ballistics testing of the prototype bombs. It existed in self-sufficient isolation. No one would go off base for a drink and give away any secrets. Or so Tibbets thought, until he got word from intelligence agents that a couple of his mechanics had been bragging about their secret mission in Salt Lake City. Tibbets hauled them into his office.
You know, you're talking, you're breaking security in wartime. I said, I've got to debate whether I ought to put you in front of a court-martial and have you shot, or whether what I would do. Go back to the barracks and stay there. And you're limited to the barracks and the mess hall. That's the only places you can go. You can't go to the exchange, you can't go anywhere else.
Fortunately, information about what exactly Tibbets was doing was so tightly controlled that even the people working for him had no idea what they were working on.
You had to have a green airplane, a green pass to get on an airplane. You had to have an orange pass to get into the area of the ordnance people. Just to be in the camp that we had, you had to have a white pass. So everybody had three passes if they were going either to the airplanes or the other to the ordnance section. Well, those were very few and far between, obviously.
The 509th formed officially in December 1944 and quickly grew to more than 200 officers and 1,500 men, almost all of them completely mystified about their location, their mission, and the heavy security that surrounded them.
Whoever chose Tibbets chose well. Tibbets is a remarkable leader. You discover this instantly if you talk to the people that he led during World War II. He is a remarkable organizer. He is a leader, an organizer, an airman. He has just many personal qualities that I think just kind of stand out.
Tibbets asked for and got 15 brand new B-29s, stripped of armament and armor, modified with fast-opening bomb bay doors, equipped to carry a single 10,000-pound bomb.
Now, where I worked in the States was easy, keep them flying over the West where there's nothing. But I wanted them to get over-water training, and I arranged to get Batista Field in Havana, Cuba, where I could send 3 airplanes at a time down there, let them stay there for a couple of weeks. They flew over water at night, they flew over water in the daytime. They had to use the sun, all the daylight flights, they had to use the stars on the night flights. And they got very good at what they were doing.
The 509th started moving to the Pacific island of Tinian in the spring of 1945. Tinian was the American air base closest to Japan, and the 509th set up its operations separate from everyone else on the island.
The special training the crews received, it was primarily to increase accuracy, and then they also had to know that they could not use the normal technique for bombing. Normally, you fly straight and level over a target, you drop your weapons, and they fall below the aircraft, and they fall basically under the aircraft until they hit the ground. You cannot do that with an atomic weapon because the blast will come straight up, the mushroom clouds we're familiar with. So they had to develop a new technique, and the crews had to be prepared for this, which once the weapon was dropped, the plane would immediately make a sharp turn and dive away so they would be out of the blast range.
Along with his pilots and mechanics, there was a group of nuclear technicians who would assemble the bomb. President Truman was at the Potsdam Conference when he was informed that the first test of a working nuclear device was a success. The explosion, far from population centers in the New Mexico desert, was like nothing the world had ever seen. On the way back from the conference, Truman gave the order to go forward with the atomic bombing of Japan. At 2 o'clock in the morning, August 6, 1945, Tibbets' plane, the Enola Gay, began its long roll down the runway on Tinian. Once in the air, the technicians aboard finished the final assembly of the bomb, which was nicknamed Little Boy. The flight was uneventful. Japanese radar detected the Enola Gay and its escort just after dawn and broadcast an alert. At 8:16, the Enola Gay's bombardier released Little Boy over the center of Hiroshima.
No regrets, whatever. I've never lost a night's sleep. I've never lost 15 minutes sleep. This was war. I didn't carry the war with me. I didn't start the war. I had a job to do during wartime. And nothing personal entered into that. I was going to do what I was told to do.
Tibbets put the plane into a steep dive to gain speed, swung back in the direction he had come from. He pressed the throttles forward, and when the protective goggles he had been instructed to wear kept him from seeing his instruments, he took off. He needed 8 miles between him and the explosion for his crew to survive the shockwave. They made it, barely, and when they got back to Tinian, they were greeted as heroes. 8 days later, the war was over. The flight over Hiroshima was Colonel Paul Tibbets' last combat mission.